Welcome to the Future of Data Centers, a mini podcast series from the viewpoint of server farmers and data growers. In this sustainability-focused series, hear from industry experts as they guide IT leaders on an important journey to combat climate change.
Hey everybody, I'm Joel Makower, Chairman and Executive Editor of GreenBiz, your host for this sustainability-focused mini-series with Arun Shenoy, Vice President of Sales and Marketing, and Sam Brown, Vice President of Engineering and Construction of Serverfarm, along with journalist and writer Ambrose McNevin. Today, we bring you the second episode of our three-part mini-series on the critical and sometimes controversial topic of data centers and sustainability. The topic of today's episode is lights out data centers. There's been a lot of talk about every data center going lights out in the future. What's that all about? Is that a lot of hype? Are fully automated lights out data centers living up to that hype? But before we blast off a little pre-flight checklist, I want to find out the latest news from your respective neck of the woods. Arun, let's find out about sustainability news out of the UK.
Thank you, everyone. I kind of wanted to pick sort of three items, and they don't happen, or they're not data center specific, but they effectively serve as the umbrella of ultimately what every industry is aiming for. And sort of thinking about as the UK and our sort of close neighbors, I think most people have heard of the EU Green Deal that focuses on achieving climate net zero by 2050. The UK actually has a slightly more ambitious target to do the same by 2045. And I think interestingly enough was the sort of first economy, the first major economy in the world, to really make what, at least from today's point of view, looks like, a very, very solid commitment. And I think that sort of theme in general, so governments and organizations, the United Nations, getting together to make those pledges is a very, very important first step. It is, by the way, the tiniest of important first steps, because ultimately they're words. It's a pledge, it's a piece of paper, and it becomes our responsibility in the context of our, our sort of climate stewardship, to go and implement those things. And we'll talk about, some of those things that we're going to be doing. And one final point, the UK is hosting COP26 this year in November. So I think that's going to bring a lot of attention, to this part of the world, with everything that went on with the Paris Climate Agreement, and the fact that the US rejoined, which I think is fantastically welcome news. I think it's going to be particularly important and interesting this year.
Yeah, and I look forward to being there in Glasgow at COP26. But let's go across the pond to you, Sam. How do things look stateside from sustainability news as it relates to data centers?
Yeah, I think the most interesting news is that there isn't much news right now. I think it's coming up on our new president's first 100 days in office. Arun mentioned we've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. I think everyone is sort of waiting to see what a more environmentally focused administration is going to wind up implementing, and how that's going to trickle down to the data center sector. So, yeah, we're all waiting to see what happens.
So let's talk about lights out data centers. That's a concept that's been around for a while. In fact, it actually dates back to good old AOL days. But recently the term has been emerging globally. Talk a little bit about, Arun, talk a little bit about what lights out data center is, and what does it have to do with sustainability?
Well, I'm a relatively simple person, so I thought I'd go back to why do lights exist in a data center? So if there are lights, why turn them out? Well, the reason for lights is for people, so that they could see where they're going. And part of the reason for that, and a very big reason, by the way, is that data centers going back 15 or 20 or even longer years were, generally speaking, very heavily staffed environments. And they were really very heavily staffed for a whole raft of reasons. primarily because the ability for any organization or individual to have visibility of what was going on in the infrastructure was so limited that the only way they could be comfortable that things were working properly is that they could go in and have a look. And by the way, when we talk about lights, it's actually interesting to talk about where are the lights in a data center. Well, the lights are obviously in the room, but there are also lights on things. There are lights on servers, and there are lights on storage arrays, and lights on, network ports. All of those lights only exist so that somebody can look at them. So that then helps us define what is meant by lights out. Lights out, as it correctly does, implies that there are no people in the data center. That then further implies that the data center is somehow autonomous. Its systems work without the need for too much human intervention. They present that information to people remotely, so that there's some individuals that had the need to be in the data center now no longer have that need, because they have enough confidence in everything running as it should. Clearly, however, I'm talking about the future because we are quite some way from that. There are some types of environments where it can be reasonably deployed, it can be reasonably run as a lights out operation, but those are a very, very tiny fraction of today's infrastructure. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of this discussion to say, how do we get there? How do we get there faster? What needs to happen? We have a whole bunch of topics in this conversation, that all need to progress and develop over time, for us to achieve this outcome.
Well, that sounds like a good question for Sam. So Sam, how does the industry ramp up and reconfigure the infrastructure? And how does that happen in critical sectors? Are there data center management services that would even support this?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of customers start taking ownership of their deployments within co-location facilities by, taking when I say take control, they're taking some of the facility aspects away from the data center provider and taking it on themselves, like battery autonomy, making sure that they are the ones in the driver's seat and they're getting maximum visibility into, generally speaking, just power and cooling being available at their infrastructure. But I would say that, it's never going to go away entirely. And I think there are absolutely processes and services that are in place. We use a platform called InCommand that, we use to drive some serious data analytics as far as availability and capacity. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways to do it, but really it comes down to process, on the front end and the platforms that are available to the landlords to make sure that the processes are being run effectively.
So Ambrose, what are your thoughts on this?
Initially, I'd say that when talking to IT directors of old school and CIOs of the new school, a lot of them would be amazed there were any lights in the data center to begin with. Often they were so separated from the physical infrastructure because they would consider it that engineers, mechanical and electrical, were so abstracted from what their business was that they would be amazed that we're not already running black box data centers that are fully autonomous. However, the reality is that for the vast majority of data centers there are people walking around with clipboards, writing things down to make sure things still work and looking at how, when was the last time they were maintained? When is the next maintenance round that has to be done? Tapping things on racks and saying, is this thing actually working? But I think we're on the journey now. I think there is a coming together for IT and FM, as it used to be called, but the M&E function, where there's a much greater understanding of what happens there. And I think that's going to facilitate the journey to a lights out data center.
So note to self, I'm going to sell all of my stock in clipboard companies for sure. But let's get into, so how is this all going to happen without people? I imagine, and Ambrose, I'm going to stick with you for a second. What's the role of analytics, AI, machine learning, robotics? What's their role in the future lights out data center?
I think there's a definition I would bring in from IBM of what a next generation data center is, and again this pulls into IBM clearly the world's leading AI company, and certainly the first through the door on that. And they go for software defined. A software defined environment change the rules governing how resources are deployed, literally programming in an organization's business objectives. So if you think about that, that's quite a huge statement for what we're actually talking about here, is changing the physical aspects and operations, or the operations of physical machines, by programming into it what the business outcome has to be. And I think, if I may, from a server farm perspective, we're talking about virtualized infrastructure operations and programming in how those resources can be run in the right place at the right time to serve the business. And that's to meet efficiency, cost, and sustainability objectives. And that really does mean not just inside a data center moving things from one server to another, but even moving things from one data center to another. I think that's where we're going with this. And I think AI and automation will play an increasing part of that, but I don't think that you don't need AI in order to actually start delivering that now.
Do you agree, Arun? We don't really need as much technology as it would seem to me we would need, given that we've taken people largely out of the equation.
No, so I do agree, and the role of technology is paramount. But Ambrose is absolutely right. It's not just about technology; it's also about process. One of the reasons, and we often talk about, the skills in our particular industry being, either in short supply or not supplied adequately well in certain parts of the industry. I think over, let's say, the last 30 years, we've somewhat become dependent on individuals and the knowledge that they possess within themselves. And that's because the data center industry, compared to, let's say, other mission critical environments, whether it's hospitals or oil and gas refineries or nuclear power stations, is actually quite immature compared to those industries. Those industries don't use AI to control, things in let's say, utility production plants or hospitals. They do to a certain extent in terms of monitoring information, closed loop control of sort of smaller systems. And I want to come back to, what Ambrose said in terms of, sort of IBM's prediction of where they see this moving. But a big part of this is really making sure that there is sufficient process that defines how infrastructure is run. And let's use the airline industry as an example. Do you need skilled operators in the airline industry? Absolutely you do. Do you need skilled engineers and skilled maintenance people? Absolutely you do. Is there any substitute for them? None whatsoever. But every single one of them is completely and utterly governed by process. There is no, oh, I think this might work, let me give it a try. That doesn't exist. And that is because there's a whole bunch of reasons, but the cost of failure is just too horrible to bear. Whereas the cost of failure in an IT environment it's different. To a certain extent for, and I might be being, a little bit controversial here, but for the last 30 or so years, it's sort of been not okay to fail, but people don't get found out because the process doesn't allow good root cause analysis to be done and so on and so forth. And a lot of that, as I said, is process, but it is also supplemented by technology. Having the right data, knowing what is going on in an environment, being able to backtrace things, technology absolutely helps. But I did also want to talk about people, and Sam talked about it earlier. We're not going to get to a place where especially larger facilities can be entirely people-free. In the same way that large, utility production systems or oil and gas refineries are not people-free either. You do need some local capability that is able to troubleshoot or think about solutions, for sort of problems as they arise, especially problems that might not have been foreseen.
So piggybacking on what Ambrose and Aaron said, I think there is a place for AI in the data center, but I think it's more in the predictive analytics side of life. I think if you start applying, and this would require some open communication between people that, our peer group that doesn't typically openly communicate. But if that were to happen, and being able to use AI to do predictive analytics to figure out when a piece of equipment is going to fail, not just relying on the manufacturers, right? Not just saying, okay, an air-cooled chiller has a 20-year life, if it's properly maintained. It's, you can actually look at things and different key performance indicators to really, I guess, give you more insight into when something's going to go wrong, and you can be proactive in mitigating that potential impact. So that, for what it's worth.
One of the other trends out there, of course, for a long time now, is the edge computing and edge data centers, driven, of course, by the demand for low latency. So Sam, sticking with you, what's the connection between that and the lights out concept?
Yeah, I think when you talk about edge data centers, those are probably the best. That's probably the baseline for lights out data centers. There are, for it to be truly edge and doing content delivery or caching or whatever it needs to do for these different services, you have to be distributed really well within. Let's just look at like a metropolitan area, like in Chicago. A company that is delivering streaming service is going to have multiple instances, speckled throughout the landscape of Chicago. And if one goes down, the others are going to be able to pick it up. So they really just don't need a lot of oversight. You'll find that not all of them are that, because they need so many. There are going to be services that exist in traditional co-location environments, but there's also going to be services that exist or present. They'll have presence in, Class C office buildings that just happen to have, a little space for a little extra power and space for cooling and a few cabinets. So, I think that they're the best. Yeah, absolute best case for baseline case for lights out data centers.
Aaron, any thoughts on lights out as it relates to edge?
I think similar to Sam, and I think the sort of, I guess the rough equation in my mind, at the very smallest unit of compute, an edge facility can be entirely lights out. Now, lights out and automation and the use of AI doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% reliable. It's just that the architecture of that environment has been designed in such a way that two things. Firstly, the cost of that location is extremely low. It's very tight, in terms of the difference between making and losing money. So the application of people in terms of operations doesn't help financially. So the design of that kind of architecture can accommodate the failure of a single unit. In other words, a unit can fail, an edge facility can fail. It's okay if the replacement turns up a day or two later, because the rest of the environment is able to, to accommodate that failure. As you go up in terms of size, the bigger the facility, the more complicated a facility, the more likely it is to have, on-site people. And the equation tends to stack up relatively well. So once you get to, a sort of a few hundred racks, the economies of those facilities lend themselves to having people on site. Now, I'm not suggesting that you put people on site just because the economies demand it, but the infrastructure has that demand as well. So once a facility gets to a certain size, it inherits a certain level of complexity. Not all of those problems associated with the complexity can be solved, through automation and AI.
We've only briefly touched on the power, but of course, the energy cost of a data center is the bottom line as it relates to environmental impact and probably a lot of the financial impact. Sam, what is the correlation between a lights out data center and what's its contribution to reducing its environmental impact?
That's a really interesting question. Obviously you can talk about just what's going on in the facility. I think it ties more to, you know, a lights out data center. You are going to be doing less maintenance. You're going to be doing, you know, facilities teams aren't going to be traveling to the site every day. There's just sort of an overall reduced carbon footprint, but it's not like you're going to, if I'm being honest, it's not going to be that much less. I mean, when you're talking about operational carbon, you know, the 20 megawatts worth of UPS systems are going to drown, you know, the potential impacts, I think, of a lights out facility. I don't know if that's going to be a popular opinion, but it's certainly, I think that's the reality of it. Yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, Ambrose, do you agree with that?
We're still looking for a definition of edge from a data center perspective that covers every eventuality. And there's some good reports coming out. ASHRAE did a good edge data center report in terms of sustainability and what it looks like. But if an edge data center can be something that sits in a 5G cell tower or sits in a brick-built environment next to a hospital or another facility, or on a roof somewhere, or is on a sidewalk, you know, that's a huge number of variables in terms of what you're talking about. But I think to Sam's point, they have to be lights out by definition, because if you have to maintain them and have a high touch intervention-based maintenance program, which is not going to work because it probably won't be cost effective, then every time you open the door on one of those in a harsh environment next to a road with trucks rolling by, you're actually increasing the risk of it going down. You're not adding to the fact that it's going to its maintainability or its operations uptime is going to continue, and thereby you're introducing new sustainability risks as well. So whether they're factory built, commoditized, and then repeatable and kind of stamped out and then done that, but I think one of the key things about it is about the idea of remote management. Edge data centers and remote management go hand in hand for delivering those sustainability or keeping the sustainability, meeting the sustainability objectives, so that you do maximize the utilization, you maximize the efficiency, and then you know what's going on inside the edge data center, whatever type it is.
Yeah. Arun, I'll give you the last word on this.
Just to build on what Ambrose said, and the sort of build on the sort of topic of remote management. An edge environment is where the remote management of the IT environment and the remote management of, let's call it, the facility environment are most closely matched with each other. And that's because both of those two things are very likely going to be in that place for exactly the same length of time. So actually, from a sustainability perspective, it should be argued that if an organization that owns and deploys edge infrastructure has done a good job designing the architecture, then the life cycle and therefore the complexity of the mechanical electrical side of the equation and the IT equation are matched 100% with each other. And then as you go up the stack, as facilities become more complex and bigger in terms of size and scale, those mechanical and electrical systems become more monolithic in their approach. And that's where you potentially lose some of the sustainability. And therefore it's a trade-off with size and with distributedness. Because in the size equation, in a large facility, you're going to be deploying electrical infrastructure that has a life cycle of 20 and more years, if you think about generators and large transformers, paired with IT environment in the same facility, IT infrastructure in the same facility that has a useful life of maybe 2 to 3 to 5 years at the most. So you have a very different set of equations, and bringing together the kind of the lights out concepts along with sustainability makes it actually quite a hard trade-off. So you're almost solving for sustainability and automation at the same time in slightly different ways, depending on the shape and size of the infrastructure. So you can be most lights out, and you could argue most sustainable at the front end in this edge environment. But I would caution one thing. That is an environment that is absolutely open to our sort of throwaway, let's call it abuse culture. That might be too strong a term, but it is too tempting, I think, for us to deploy infrastructure like that, and when we're finished with it, just to get rid of it. So I think there's a lot to be said for those solutions having to take into account, from a sustainability perspective, a very, very strong kind of circular economy concept of what happens with that IT infrastructure. Can it be waterfalled to, a user base that is less dependent on a technology that's like 2 seconds old and are comfortable with servers that are 3 years old? And guess what? The world is full of application opportunities for that type of infrastructure. And by the way, there are lots of companies that are now starting to really leverage that as a model, which again, from a sustainability perspective, is incredibly important and goes back to our sort of 3 main concepts, right? Reuse, recycle, and reduce. And the more we can do, especially of the first 2, the more sustainable we can be.
Wow, what a great conversation. But before we go lights out on this episode, let's take a quick flashback journey on your own data center journeys. Arun, what's your first data center?
Oh, that is a good question. My first data center was a small test facility when I worked for IBM in 1986, 87. Where we were trying out storage systems and how to make them more efficient and more reliable. And so that was my first experience of the sort of coming together of the IT discipline and the mechanical electrical discipline.
Yeah.
By the way, two very, very different foreign languages compared to each other.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, Sam, talk about somebody who mentored you, or maybe someone that you mentored. Can you give him a shout out?
Sure. There a guy that I actually still work with, or he's involved in a company that I still work with, but Dave Hall, we've worked together for 5 or 6 years, and I think he's the president or CEO of Clean now. But he told me a long time ago that you always put family first in this business, that he's seen a lot of people not do that, and the harsh sort of impacts that can bring to bear on your life. So yeah, I think his exact quote was something like, "They all get built, whether you're there or not, it's probably still going to happen. So make sure you have your priorities straight." So yeah, Dave, thank you, Dave.
Great advice, probably for anyone in any business, but it sounds like in this one in particular. Well, we'll put a wrap on this. Thanks for joining us, Arun, Sam, and Ambrose, talking about what lies ahead for sustainability and the data center industry.
For more insightful episodes of the future of data centers, be sure to check out serverfarmllc.com/podcast for additional episodes available on demand, as well as other upcoming mini podcast series.